Hi, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Better Events Podcast. In this week's episode, we are talking all about tipping at events. It is a topic that I feel like can be both frustrating and I guess exciting if you're someone who receives a tip. But we dive into what do we mean by tipping? When do you tip? When have we maybe received a tip from a client? As well as maybe some of the non-conventional ways that you can compensate folks who. But this question came from one of you listeners, and we're so excited to dedicate an entire episode to tipping. So let's get into the episode.
Welcome to the Better Events Podcast. Join two event strategists, Logan Clements and Mary Davidson, who believe we can all create, host, and attend better events. In this podcast, you will learn about event strategy and actions that you can use today as an event host, planner, or manager. Hear directly from the people who are creating innovative and inspiring events today and tomorrow, and grow your business along the way. Now, let's get started, and thanks for listening to the Better Events Podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another week of the Better Events Podcast. We are so thrilled to be with you today. We are going to be talking all about tipping at events and all of the wonderful things that have to do with that. This is a commonly asked question. But before we get into it, we have our conversation starter for today presented by Pro Event Tips, which is led by a member of the Better Events community, Gabby Rabuccio. And our question is, if you could have a lifetime supply of one snack, but it had to be a little unusual, what would you pick, Logan?
Gabby, for starters, I love this question, but I will have to say unusual, I feel like is open to interpretation. So when I saw this question, I said, Mary, you're going to guess exactly what I'm going to say. And it's something that I feel like I already have a semi-lifetime supply of, and that's pickles. And not just pickles, but also pickle juice. Listeners, I will link in the show notes, but you can buy in the same size bottle as the little 5-hour energies. You can buy little shooters of pickle juice. There's no alcohol in them. They're literally just pickle juice. I think they came on the scene as a way to help you with hydration because it's like salt and brine. And if you're dehydrated, like for athletes, it's helpful. My mom started buying them for me. Shout out, mom. And I think I get every Christmas now at least a month's supply of these little pickle juice shots. So yeah, it'd be pickles and specifically pickle juice.
I'm actually surprised by that. I thought you were going to say pretzels. So
That's not unusual though.
it's not unusual. You're right. I was just watching a TV show. If you are listening to this and know what it is, you'll know. And someone was saying they don't like pickles, but they do like the little bag of individual, like chopped up pickles that you can get. Like it's a different flavor. So maybe you're
Yes.
into those as well.
Those are my favorite. Snacking. I feel like they get called snacking pickles because they come in a little pouch. But yes, pickles. Mary, what's yours?
Mine is unusual, right? So something that I feel like I couldn't live without. I would be sad if I didn't have it for a snack occasionally. I don't eat it all the time either, but I love beets. Is that a snack? I think it could be because you get Logan's laughing at me. Little snack of beets, some cut up beets. As I'm saying this out loud, it does not sound like a snack, but that was the first thing that came to mind.
I feel like my pickles like made you think of an adjacent snack.
Maybe
I'm
that's
dying,
the one.
listeners, if you are watching our video podcast, mainly because I hate beets.
You hate them because they taste like dirt, right? Everybody says that.
Well, if it tastes like dirt, I can deal with their like tiny pieces in like a salad where they're like a little just garnish. Great. But yeah, not a big fan
You're
of that.
not alone, but for any beet lovers out there, I'm with you.
All I gotta say is if you want to send us listeners some pickle juice and some beets, you're gonna hit both Mary and I, and we're not gonna share. It's gonna be great. You
It's gonna
make
be
both of us
great.
happy.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh, so funny. Well, a little bit more about why we chose this topic. I made a joke, and I think I specifically might have joked about this in an episode last season. I apologize, listeners. Mary and I are in the throes of busy event season right now, so I cannot go back and tell you exactly what episode it was, but we answered a question about tipping, and I said we could do a whole episode on it, and you asked for it. So here we go. We're going to be talking all about tipping in the event industry, I think from both sides, both as people receiving tips and or providing tips. So Mary, you know it, you love it. We start broad. What do we mean when we say tipping?
I think you just started to go into it perfectly. It might be something that we receive or like a vendor receives, but it's just that little cherry on top, that little monetary cherry. That's actually kind of perfect on top And yeah, I mean that's like the simplest thing. That's not included in the pricing that you're already paying for something. Most likely. We're gonna get into that probably a little bit more. But Logan, what would you add to that?
No, couldn't agree more. I think you're going to hear, I will give some examples as we get into it of maybe not directly monetary versions of tipping, just because I don't want to limit ourselves. But yes, I feel like often if we're talking about providing a tip for any event staff, it is usually additional money, monetary funds, cash, you name it. So, yeah, I think again, it's going to be a broad topic, and we are by no means the experts on this.
Yeah, definitely. It's an interesting topic that like I honestly don't know that I've thought like this is the most I've thought about it as we're talking about this. So maybe you feel similarly, but it's important. So especially when we work in the hospitality industry, right? So it's very part of this world. And so Logan, how would you say tipping plays a part in the industry?
Yeah, I think in the hospitality industry overall, I mean, tipping is a crucial chunk of a lot of workers' income. And events, we are just one piece of that hospitality industry. And just I'm thinking back to, working, if you were working as a server where your hourly wage is minimal and anything that you're really taking home is more tips. So you heavily rely on tipping. My first job in the event and hospitality industry was working at a country club. Where I feel like I had the most ironic experience with tipping because we were paid a decent hourly wage, but then that meant I don't think we got all of our tips. I think we only made about 20% of whatever a patron would tip us on like a bill. Like if I worked Easter brunch or something, and they would use catering or like banquet staff to help with that. And I remember a gentleman that I gave him the bill and he looked at me, he said, "You did such a great job." And like I could tell, like wrote a nice big tip and handed it to me. And I was like, I can't remember. I think we weren't allowed to tell them, but it was one I was like, "Sir, I'm going to see like 20% of this because it goes to the country club." Again, that's just how they structured it. Our hourly was better. So we very rarely relied on tips. But it is something that since I started working on that side of the industry before getting into events, I feel like I've always kept it top of mind. I mean, this is again, servers, bartenders. I think a lot of us, as we've gotten older, have probably gotten away from even tipping like your housekeeping staff at the hotels we're staying at. And it is something that you're seeing more and more out in your daily lives. You're seeing tipping be a thing. And I know it can be very visceral for some folks. So, Mary, how would you answer that question?
It's interesting because I think it depends like the type if we're getting more specific into the hospitality industry, the type of event, most certainly. I was just thinking this through, and this is what's hard. I feel like our job is very much service based. It's customer service, and so it's similar to restaurants and things like that when you attend. But this is what's challenging is I'm like our job naturally is to go above and beyond. Like we need to do that no matter what. So how do you tip when someone goes above and beyond, like, or what's the expectation there? And I don't know that it's necessarily black or white. I think that there are certain ways that we see tipping commonly at events, which we'll talk more about, and then also typical people who get tipped. And I don't know that we as event planners and producers are one of those people. And so I agree with everything you said, but it's an interesting dynamic, I will say.
Yeah, and this whole episode came from a question from one of our listeners who asked, "What is the standard for tipping in the event industry, and who should I even be considering?"
Hmm.
And again, it's a simple question, but to your point, Mary, like complex. I mean, what's your first take at this person's question?
First take. Okay, so I started doing some brainstorming and I went to ChatGPT because I was like, let's think like different events through. And it lists so many vendors. Like name a vendor that we work with for an event. It's probably on this list. And it gives a suggested amount for each of them, which is actually very interesting. But the one vendor, it says event planner or coordinator, a tip is not required. And every other vendor, it gives a suggested amount. I'm like, is it psyching me out right now? Because it knows I ask a lot of planning about events. It's like, you don't get tipped.
Your chat GPT is just trolling you.
Yeah,
Everybody but you, Mary. That's the answer to the question.
literally, that's what it's saying. So is that actually true, Logan? What do you think?
I mean, to be honest, in what I do as an event producer, working with event production teams, in the last year, thinking back on it, I personally have not tipped. I also have not in the traditional way that you're asking ChatGPT. I'm sure it said like 10% or something. I have not received a tip in that traditional format. I'm going to talk more about some of my non-traditional ways that I think I've received either extra monetary funds or treated extra well because of, because of going above and beyond. I feel like this is something that's more common in the wedding industry
Yeah.
and like social events. Um, and anytime you're dealing with catering, I know it's really nice to allocate in your budget to know that you want to add an additional tip, especially. And again, it is something you're welcome to evaluate them on based on how they actually do. But I know for like an AV provider and a production partner, they're never expecting a tip. So, yeah, so that's one where I'm not regularly having to personally budget in the events I'm doing to have tips.
Yeah, and I think like the most common place that you'll see it as far as the expectations of the industry are in service charges. That feels like way more common. um, which is a lot of corporate events. And when you're working with caterers, I think caterers almost every time include that service charge, which oftentimes will include gratuity. And so make sure you're checking those contracts or those invoices or whatever when it comes to tipping, most certainly. But yes, Logan, to your point, the one time I was tipped was when I was doing a day of coordination wedding event and never again. So very, very interesting, but also on truly not expected. Like if somebody did that, I'd be like, whoa, this is, what do I do with this? Like it feels almost, I don't know, for me, uncommon. But yeah, anyways, I think it can look a lot of different ways, definitely. But what would you say? We're starting to talk about this a little bit more, Logan. What's the difference between service fees and gratuities?
Yeah, I think this is a good call out because I think, again, from my experience working at a country club, I think a lot of people saw tip or event services and they're like, oh, that's the tip for the staff. And I will say more often than not, your service fee is not going to the actual staff that work your event, specifically on the venue side and the catering side. It often is. And I think a lot of companies are getting better in their contracts explicitly saying, the service fee is, not necessarily gratuity would be in addition to this if you'd want to leave something extra for the folks who worked your event. Um, but really you have to either check your contract or if it's really vague, I would ask. Um, and again, neither Mary or I are like wedding or party planners, but it is something that I would anticipate having like 10% of whatever you're paying your vendors if it's a wedding, like available and particularly probably in cash to give to vendors that you want to tip that have gone above and beyond for what you're paying them for. But again, don't see that really in my corporate space. I don't even see it in my nonprofit sports. There is no tipping in the sports industry for the roles that I'm doing. So
Well, I'm just thinking through like an actual, like thinking through walking through an event and like who actually has that tip jar in front of them. And it's interesting how we decide who can do that and who can't, like if you really think about it. And I was thinking that those people are the bartenders, right? Almost always they're going to have that tip jar there. Coat check attendants, I've seen that tip jar there as well. And then also like if you have transportation and you have drivers, that's just common outside of the industry as well, but like those people are getting a tip also. Yeah, I think it's less common for other individuals that I didn't mention, but isn't that interesting? And I think that's why tipping is hard, right? Because like how do we decide what some do and some don't? So Logan, why do you think tipping is hard?
I think the reason tipping is so hard is because it is not defined and there's not a set amount that you always need to give people. And to your point, Mary, some of it's arbitrary. I think your question there is it's I feel like tipping is normal for folks coming out of that traditional service industry. So coming out of like the restaurants where we always tip in restaurants. And so it's traditional then for those workers, if they're working an event, they expect a tip as well. I think coat check's another one because again, they come from maybe the club scene that you'd have coat check at clubs and you would normally give them cash and tip. And same thing with drivers because coming off of like maybe taxis. And so that's where I think any vendor that doesn't fall into maybe a similar category outside of events, you're not going to see that. And that's what makes it really, really difficult. And then I also think it's generational. Like I have a lot more memories of my dad having cash on him all the time to tip folks when we were traveling as a family. I know often it was because we're a large family. And so he would feel extra bad because there were just more of us using the bathroom and, in the hotel room and stuff like that. And I travel all the time now. And I feel like I'm sometimes bad because I forget to bring that cash with me or to look for the QR code to tip. So I'm I think it's just something that's constantly like tipping culture is constantly evolving. And some people carry it into events. And I'd be interested if some listeners reached out regionally, if it's different. Because China, where I lived and first got started in events, there's no tipping. That's not a thing. It's actually slightly insulting because it means you think you make more money than the other person. So you're kind of like looking down on them. So you don't tip. Unless you're American and they find out you're American and you're traveling, then they know Americans just like to tip. But here in Seattle, I have not found, or the events I work for, that it is a commonplace thing in my area.
Yeah, I super agree. And I was just thinking even um there was one client that we were working with and they said like near the end of last year, like, thank you so much to your team. I want like to give them a gift, and it's basically a tip, but they're like, just invoice me for it like the next time that you invoice, and then I will pass that on to them because for a job well done, right? But so I was like, actually, I think there's a tip. It just came across a little differently, like more of a gift, right? Than like an expected tip.
Yeah, and that's what I think, getting into our next question about how have you ever received one. On my invoices, I use QuickBooks, and I actually have the option. I just keep it turned on to be like, leave a tip. Just because I went, you know what, let me just put it there and we'll see what people do. I'm not ever asking for it. I'm not asking people to do it. Not many people pay me through QuickBooks, but I just kept it enabled. And no one has used that, but I've had the same scenario where I had an event that went a little, again, we had to go above and beyond. They were a little extra difficult. And the like account lead messaged me and was like, hey, just invoice me for 2 more days.
Oh
And that
wow.
again
Yeah.
is their version of, tipping and adding to my contract. But again, I wouldn't, in my head, to your point, Mary, like I wasn't like, oh, I got a tip. It would, in my head, I heard it more as like a bonus of like, and it wasn't, it was because we had to deal with all these other things that I was like, oh, it's just I'd done the work and now they're compensating me for it. Um, but yeah.
Yeah. I would say like if you're a US based planner, I don't know that I can speak to the other like countries as much, but a tip generally isn't going to be offensive to people. Like if you're thinking about should you tip a certain kind of vendor or whatever for your event, I don't think it hurts, but like what's the expectation? Hopefully we've kind of addressed that a little bit more. Like here are the typical vendors that you can tip, but even then, I mean like what's the rule? It's all just like you said arbitrary. So yay. So Logan,
Yeah.
when have you like tipped some of your vendors or contractors or anything else like that?
Yeah, I don't think I've done the straight up monetary tip in the sense of like, oh yeah, here's an extra 10%. But I've definitely tried to go above and beyond on the little things. And I think that's where, for tip, like how I experience tipping, it's more, what are the little, like having snacks on site is an example, or a coffee station for the crew that is there all day. Like that is a cost. Someone has to pay for that, whether that's you as the agency hiring all these contractors, or it's the client pays for it. Like that is a way to show appreciation. And we've done episodes here on the podcast about how to show gratitude to your team. I would count some of those things in that category as tipping. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but that is a way to show that you care and you acknowledge that. And that's something that, like, I know I like to do. Like Mary and you and I work an event every February that I try to do a team dinner for. And that is something now that I like budget into my overall event budget, because I was like, I just want to be able to do this and not have to think about how much it costs. I want to factor that in. And to me, that is, again, not a tip, but just something extra that I'm trying to do, and making sure I'm like accounting for that.
Yeah, and something else I was thinking too, like if you're like an event planner or producer for an event, this is also part of our job, I think, to advocate a little bit for tips, at least for the, those certain like we can advise on that service charge situation that Logan was talking about. And I think it just strengthens those vendor relationships between us and the vendor if we're like, hey, just so you know, like they did a really great job. So if you like want to do something about that or go above and beyond, that's up to you. But like I think it means a lot to say something, good about the vendors that you're seeing working with at an event, and the client can decide if they want to do something a little bit more. But I think that truly is part of our role, is advocating for them, even in the sense of tipping.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I was going to say, for the listener who asked this question, I would not be afraid to ask. Like all of these vendors, your catering partner, I mean, any of them that you could be like, yeah, let's figure out what it's included in the service fee, what's not. And then maybe you say, what's a typical gratuity that you guys receive for a project like this? And that's not you promising that that's what you'd come in at, because again, it's a gratuity. But I think that can help educate you. Also, yeah, regionally and the type of events that can help. And I know we've talked about this in our event budgeting episodes, but that's part of, like, I would factor either tips in as their own budget item. Again, if I was doing a wedding, I would have tips as a budget line item because it's that considerable amount for that many vendors, or have a contingency, that 10% of your total event fee that is something that you can pull from if you want to do tips. Cash, I feel like, is always appreciated over actually like running a card, just because people have to take, chunks of slices from that. And then to go another unconventional way to kind of tip your community, and this isn't even tip, this should be standard, but I advocate it for my AV teams all the time, is a hot meal goes a long way with your vendors, and making sure you're factoring them in when you're planning your meals for your attendees. Often that means you need food early. And because you need food early, that's why I say the word hot. A lot of your vendors are going to be getting usually a cold meal or grab and go sandwiches or something, because that is truly easier to do. But when you get a hot meal, I was on site for an event last week that had like a really good hot meal for our dinner that we usually had been getting deli sandwiches for the previous like couple times. And I went up and complimented the organizer, because I said, I just want you to know that went a long way. Like, our crew was complimenting how nice it was to have, you know, like steamed veggies, this really good pasta, and like grilled chicken. And it was solid. And I was like, you're making them do a better job today because they're just happy. So that's another way to think about if you work at a company where maybe you'd get pushback for having a light item that says tips, but you can advocate in different ways, like having that hot crew meal would also go a long way.
Yeah, I just have to call it out here, even though I think I've called it out before on another episode. But I was part of like a production crew specifically in Orlando, and a lot of people do events in Orlando. So if you know the venue I'm talking about, let me know. But it was the best crew food I've ever had. They didn't skimp on the food for the crew. They had like sushi one day and like a bunch of nice things. So I couldn't agree more. And then I also was thinking about fundraising events, because we do a lot of fundraising events, and I think the tipping expectation is worth mentioning for that, because it's, I think, completely different actually. Um, it's hard because the purpose of these events is coming to, in many cases, raise money for a cause. And so a lot of times those folks who are staffing Coat Check are volunteers. And so we've had volunteers get tipped and they're like, oh, like, no, like we don't have a, like, we're not accepting tips. And then people are just at that point maybe a little bit wasted, and they're like, you know what, just keep it. And that happens so much. They're like, just keep the money. And so the volunteer will, pass it on to the organization. Now all of a sudden it's like this little donation, but people are used to doing it, and so they're like, just take it. But it goes straight back to the org. So I mean, maybe it works. um but I've seen that. And then like I've also know that there's actually a little bit of a controversy in the industry about having bartenders collect tips at a fundraising event. So it does look a little bit different depending on what it is.
Yeah, and that's, again, I think sometimes the client would lead that. I feel like if you're talking about controversy, I'm sure there's some clients that don't like the optics of that and others that don't mind it. Because again, to me, if I'm serving drinks, I'm providing you probably the same level of service, whether it's a corporate event or it's a nonprofit event. And yeah, I can see where that can be kind of a blurred line. So again, I think you, as the planner or the producer or the event manager, I put that on you, just to ask those questions, because I feel like tipping only goes wrong when the two parties are not aligned. Like, the bartenders are expecting it, they're upset. Again, if you're trying to work an event there again, like, then that maybe could impact your event in the future. Or like anytime you're trying to repeat something versus if you get ahead of it. Or I know anytime you have to spend money, it's always nice to already have those envelopes ready that you don't have to even think about, oh shoot, I got to put a tip down. It's not a surprise charge or something like that. But yes, I would also challenge the idea that service fee piece is so key. Like, don't think that that's what's going to everybody automatically, because I think a lot of us at first, if you're new to the industry, see that you're like, oh wow, that's like a 25% service fee when you work with hotels. And it's like, that's not going to the actual person at the front desk. That's not actually going to the housekeeping team. I'm sure it's going towards helping pay their like regular wages and things. But I think my last point on tipping, if you again can't afford a monetary, that crew meal, having a little extra bonus crew snacks, little surprises, something like that, but also like leaving reviews for these businesses and these companies that you work with. Like, that's, again, not a financial need, but you taking 15 minutes to write them a Google review or write them something nice for their LinkedIn page for their company or the individual. Like, that's another way to tip them with, street cred for future business.
I love it. I think those are great tips, both monetary and not monetary. So hopefully there's something that you heard that you can take away into your event. And I think I would just add, like Logan said, to just ask the question and see what you need to do. But depending on your location, I actually would love to hear from you. So if you live somewhere else, not in the US, and Logan mentioned some of her international experience where tipping is not a thing. If that's the case for you, I would love to hear about how that works. So please reach out to us and let us know what that looks like in your country as well.
Yeah, we love the international pieces. So that brings us to the end of our episode here about tipping. But Mary, before we go, you have the bonus tip this week.
I do. Okay, so our bonus tip is from a recent MPI local event that Logan and I attended. It was an educational event, and they were sharing that when you are thinking of the vendors that you need for events in general, to make sure that you stack your bench. So they use the analogy of like a sports bench. I'm like not a sports person, so where people are waiting to go on and play. That bench, stack your bench with vendors that you may need at another time. And sometimes those are vendors that are very unique, like ones that you may not ever need very often, but when you need them, like a hot air balloon vendor or something like that. So stack your bench while you have time, start figuring out the vendors that you don't have connections with and start trying to meet them for when you do. And that is the bonus tip for today.
That's a great bonus tip. And Mary, I'll forever laugh whenever you have to do a sports analogy. So I appreciated that. Listeners, that brings us to the end of this week's episode. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Better Events Pod. You can send us an email at bettereventspod@gmail.com. You can always connect with us directly on LinkedIn as well. Just let us know that you heard about us from the podcast. We love hearing from you all. And if you want more Better Events content, go and join our private community over on Substack. We have a lot of fun there in our bonus community. And as always, we thank you for listening, and we'll be back in your feeds again next Wednesday.